Summer 1943 arrived over the Pacific like a relentless, molten weight, pressing villages into the earth and bending the air with heat and the smell of smoke. From the hilltop near the Tanaka family home, Yuko squinted through the haze at the curling black plumes rising from the distant town. The rice paddies were half burned, their waters reflecting the sky like shards of dark glass. She clutched a small soot-stained doll, its porcelain face chipped, imagining that its cracked eyes understood the fear that thrummed through her chest. Hiroshi, stoic as the old cedar tree shading their porch, moved quietly among the household chores, carrying buckets of water with careful, deliberate steps, as if the weight might steady his racing thoughts. Across the waves, far from the terrified eyes of civilians, Lieutenant Richard Turner paced the deck of the USS Larkspur, inspecting maps with a precision that could turn panic into strategy. Beside him, Private Samuel Hawkins flicked a speck of ash from his sleeve and muttered a sardonic observation about the heat, as though irony could chase away the dread that clung to their skin like humidity. Turner's gaze lingered on the coastline etched into the map. Villages half hidden by shadow, small clusters of buildings that had become invisible to most of the world, yet for him, each represented a life. "Every name," he murmured, not to Hawkins but to himself, "matters." In the village, Yuko and Hiroshi moved among their neighbors, voices low and tense, the cadence of survival overriding ordinary conversation. Mrs. Keiko Sato, the elderly keeper of the town's stories, shuffled forward, cane tapping the packed earth. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, followed the rising smoke as if it were a living thing, breathing destruction into every hut and shrine. "We must stay," she said, though her voice carried the tremor of doubt. "And yet, we wait for nothing." The anticipation of the Americans' arrival, or their absence, hung in the air like a taut wire. Civilians had been taught to fear foreign soldiers, to expect occupation and conquest. And yet, Yuko felt an unnameable tension, a whisper of hope that the soldiers might bring more than just the noise of battle. The sound of distant engines, muffled by hills and distance, made her heart beat in time with the waves, each pulse a question. Would they arrive, or would the smoke swallow everything first? Turner's men moved with a ghostly determination, loading stretchers, checking weapons, whispering orders as though speaking too loudly would fracture the fragile line between life and death. Sammy Hawkins, 19 and full of sarcastic bravado, adjusted his helmet, the metal edge cutting a line into his sweat-damp hair. "If we get through this," he said, "I'm claiming desertion from heat alone." Turner shot him a glance that mixed exasperation with understanding. Humor, even in whispers, was a fragile shield against the enormity of what awaited them. In a narrow alley, Yuko ducked under a collapsed roof beam, dragging a satchel of rice and tea, imagining the smell of boiled water and hope in the same breath. Hiroshi flanked her, hands steady, eyes scanning the horizon, mapping danger as instinctively as he had planted seedlings each spring. Smoke rose from burned rooftops like the sighs of the dead, yet life persisted. Children hiding, elders observing, families clinging to each other with trembling fingers. Turner's eyes narrowed as he studied the first glimpses of the village from the reconnaissance planes. Every abandoned hut, every singed rice bale was a statistic in his head, yet each was also a story waiting for rescue. He motioned his men into formation, the rhythm of preparation measured and precise, as if the orchestration of courage could be rehearsed against the chaos of fire. Hawkins rolled his eyes at the ceremonial tension, but he moved as ordered, carrying a bundle of medical supplies like fragile treasure, fully aware that the line between saving and losing was paper-thin. Even as the sun crept higher, scorching the earth, the villagers waited, caught between the terror they had known all summer and the improbable possibility of salvation. Yuko's hands trembled, not from fear alone but from the awareness that tomorrow, or perhaps even tonight, would decide everything. The wind carried ash and whispers, and in that suspended moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Americans to step from myth into reality. By mid-afternoon, the first engines hummed louder against the horizon. Turner's landing craft cut through the water like steel knives, and Hawkins, helmet askew, felt the pulse of history beneath his boots. Yuko and Hiroshi watched, the air heavy with disbelief, as figures emerged from smoke and surf. Soldiers, human and fallible, yet moving with a certainty that defied expectation, advanced toward them. And in that moment, as the village held its breath, the boundaries between fear and hope, destruction and salvation, dissolved into a single, trembling heartbeat. Smoke still curled above them, black and defiant, but something new had arrived, a possibility, fragile and brilliant, that life could insist upon itself even in the midst of war. The landing craft struck the shallow shore with a muted splash, sending a tremor through the sand and a spray of salt water into the rising heat. Lieutenant Turner stepped out first, boots sinking slightly into the wet sand, scanning the village through narrowed eyes. Smoke still curled from the shattered rooftops, and the smell of scorched rice and charred timber clung to the air like a stubborn ghost. Sammy Hawkins followed close behind, adjusting his pack and muttering under his breath, nothing like a quiet stroll through a war zone to start the morning. Turner ignored him, but the faint curve of his lips betrayed a reluctant amusement. On the village edge, Yuko crouched behind a fragment of a wall, the doll from the previous day pressed against her chest. Her hands shook, not from fear alone, but from disbelief that these strangers, Americans, foreigners, the very soldiers she had been taught to dread, had actually arrived. Hiroshi's dark eyes swept over the beach, noting the disciplined movement of the soldiers. "They are cautious," he whispered, "but they are coming for us, not against us." Mrs. Keiko Sato, standing stiffly with her cane planted firmly, let a slow breath escape, as if acknowledging the improbable. Turner signaled a few men forward to establish a perimeter, moving with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to the delicate balance between life and death. Each soldier advanced like a measured shadow, stretchers and supplies in hand. Their presence alone seemed to draw the villagers from hiding, though each step forward carried hesitation. The paradox of relief and terror pressed on the air, as if the villagers themselves could feel the weight of courage that had not yet touched their lives. Sammy ducked under a fallen beam, scanning the alleyways with sharp, green eyes. "Well," he said, voice low, "this is either heroic or insane. Sometimes both." Turner's gaze followed him, a mix of exasperation and appreciation. Even amid impending danger, there was a human need to mock fear with a little levity. The first injured were found huddled near the collapsed granary. Turner knelt beside a boy no older than 11, his small body trembling under a thin blanket. "We're getting you out," Turner said, voice calm but edged with urgency. Sammy lifted the boy carefully onto a stretcher, whispering reassurances in English that he knew the child could not understand. Yuko's lips parted in surprise. She could not reconcile the soldier's gentle movements with the stories she had heard of invaders. Hiroshi stood nearby, ready to point out hazards and navigate through the debris, bridging knowledge between worlds that had never truly touched. Mortar fire still erupted intermittently on the horizon, a reminder that even here, salvation was not guaranteed. Turner's men moved with deliberate precision, forming small human chains to carry stretchers across open fields. Dust rose with each step, mingling with the lingering smoke to create a haze that made the line between friend and foe, life and death, almost impossible to discern. Every breath was thick with grit, every heartbeat a warning that one misstep could shatter fragile hope. Yet amid the chaos, small gestures illuminated humanity. Sammy handed a bottle of water to an elderly woman, who accepted it with trembling hands and eyes wide as if witnessing a miracle. Yuko saw her own doubts begin to waver. The fear that had stiffened her spine began to soften. Even Hiroshi, pragmatic and wary, allowed a faint nod of acknowledgement. Perhaps, just perhaps, these soldiers had come to protect rather than destroy. Turner's attention shifted constantly, balancing the safety of his men against the fragile lives they carried. "Stay low, move fast," he instructed, voice a whisper meant to cut through panic rather than add to it. The villagers began to follow, mimicking the soldiers' careful movements, learning in real time that courage could be contagious. Each person rescued was a testament to the possibility that compassion could pierce even the thickest smoke of fear. A sudden gust of wind lifted ash into the soldiers' eyes. Sammy swore softly, blinking to clear his vision, while Yuko clutched her doll tighter, heart pounding. For a moment, all that existed was movement. Forward, careful, resolute. Then, a cheer erupted from the far edge of the village as the last of the first group was safely brought to the beach. Relief rippled through both villagers and soldiers, a fragile, trembling wave that seemed almost impossible in the midst of war. Turner exhaled, allowing himself the smallest satisfaction. He glanced at Sammy, who shrugged, grinning despite the grime and heat. Yuko's eyes met his across the clearing, a spark of hope mirrored in the old woman's gaze, and even Hiroshi's stoicism cracked just enough to reveal the human heart beneath. For a fleeting moment, the war felt less like a force of destruction and more like a stage on which bravery, risk, and unexpected compassion could play out. And yet, even as the first cheers faded, Turner knew the path ahead was far from secure. The village had been touched, yes, but the true test of courage, the real measure of risk, was still to come. He straightened, voice steady, eyes sharp. "This is just the beginning. Keep moving." The villagers, wide-eyed and tentative, followed him into the uncertain smoke, and the soldiers pressed forward, carrying with them the fragile promise that salvation, however improbable, could arrive where it was least expected. The mortar fire drew closer, the earth trembling under its insistence, sending shards of wood and ash dancing across the narrow lanes of the village. Turner's men pressed forward with quiet resolve, stretchers held high, eyes sharp for every hidden threat. Sammy Hawkins's boots slipped in the mud of a broken irrigation ditch, and he muttered an apology to the universe that seemed only half serious. Turner's gaze flicked toward him, and in that split second, a flicker of humor passed between them, tiny, human, defiant in the face of chaos. Yuko clutched her doll tightly, dragging an injured boy along the uneven ground, his small frame pressed against her chest. Hiroshi ran beside her, alert to every obstruction, signaling directions with a hand gesture that had guided him through harvests, storms, and now, fire. The smoke thickened, curling like phantom fingers over the rooftops, and the sound of distant engines and explosions became a dissonant symphony. Every step was measured, every movement a negotiation with death. Yet within that precarious rhythm, the villagers and soldiers discovered a strange coordination, as if instinct alone could forge understanding. Turner knelt to lift a girl whose leg had been caught beneath a collapsed beam. The child whimpered, clutching a tattered piece of cloth, but did not resist. His hands moved with deliberate gentleness, each action calculated to reassure both the girl and himself. Sammy crouched to adjust the stretcher, his youthful grin masked by sweat and soot. "Almost poetic," he said softly, though his voice carried no irony this time. Poetry in motion, fragile and beautiful, survived amid ruin. From the rooftops, shrapnel rained intermittently, carving arcs of danger through the thick air. Hiroshi directed the civilians, calling out warnings in rapid bursts, guiding them along paths Turner's men could not see. Mrs. Keiko Sato leaned on her cane, voice calm and steady despite trembling knees, counting each villager as they emerged from hiding. 1, 2, 3. Her murmurs stitched order into chaos, a thread of human continuity amidst the firestorm. The first stretcher line reached the clearing near the river, and the soldiers began ferrying the injured across the mud-soaked banks. Turner's voice cut sharply, issuing commands that were absorbed and executed with military precision. Sammy handed water bottles to children whose eyes reflected disbelief and awe, their tiny hands trembling at the foreign generosity. Yuko, momentarily resting, watched the soldiers with a quiet, growing understanding. These were men risking everything for lives they would never claim as their own. Smoke swirled in ribbons, catching the morning light and transforming the village into a chiaroscuro painting of courage and destruction. Every movement was punctuated by the hiss of distant shells, the crackle of fire, and the occasional piercing scream of those too frightened or injured to escape the immediate peril. Turner's strategy was simple yet profound. Keep moving, protect the weak, and let the momentum carry them past the invisible line between survival and despair. Hiroshi's hands were steady on the stretcher rails, sweat streaking his face, chest rising and falling in rhythm with the chaos. He had always measured life by harvests, by seasons, by predictability, but now, each second felt like a gamble with fate. Beside him, Yuko adjusted the strap of the bundle she carried, feeling the fragile heartbeat of the boy she shielded. Every pulse was a reminder that life, even here, insisted on itself, and that bravery could be as quiet as a breath or as violent as the roar of mortar fire. Sammy's eyes scanned for threats, noting the small details that made survival possible: loose beams, uneven cobblestones, patches of slick mud. He glanced at Turner, who nodded in acknowledgement. In that nod was trust, a bond forged not by ceremony, but by shared danger and the recognition of human fragility. Turner's attention shifted constantly, the pressure of command heavy yet precise, shaping every choice to preserve as many lives as possible. Finally, the last of the injured were brought across the riverbank, the group forming a tableau of exhaustion, relief, and cautious joy. Children clung to parents, elders leaned on each other, and soldiers allowed themselves a momentary reprieve. A faint, ironic laugh broke from Sammy's lips as he tripped over a root while carrying water. Yuko smiled despite herself, a flash of humanity piercing the smoke. Turner's eyes softened, watching the fleeting moments of light amid darkness, aware that courage was measured not just in action, but in small, persistent gestures of care. The village, though scarred and battered, had survived another hour of firestorm. Smoke still curled into the sky, a reminder that danger lingered, but the human heart had asserted itself in defiance. Hiroshi guided Yuko and the children to a temporary shelter, each step marked by newfound trust. Mrs. Keiko Sato exhaled slowly, as though the weight of centuries had lifted for a single heartbeat, and even Turner allowed himself a glance at the village, imagining the stories that would survive long after the smoke cleared. Amid ash and the scent of burned rice, Turner felt a quiet affirmation. Bravery could ripple across cultures, courage could bridge oceans, and even in a world torn by war, humanity could insist on itself. And yet, as the final echoes of mortar fire faded into distance, he knew the test was not over. The next moments would demand more precision, more risk, more resolve. Every heartbeat in the firestorm had survived so far, but survival alone was only the beginning. The first light of dawn spilled over the village like molten gold, cutting through the last tendrils of smoke that had clung stubbornly to the charred rooftops. Turner squinted against the glare, sweat still crusting his brow, and felt the hollow ache of exhaustion in every joint. The firestorm of the previous hours had left the village scarred, yet alive, each surviving figure a testament to endurance. Across the clearing, Yuko steadied the boy she had carried for what felt like an eternity, his breathing shallow but steady, eyes wide as he scanned the soldiers who had become unlikely saviors. Mortar fire had ceased, leaving only the distant echoes of war, a reminder that this respite was fragile. Turner motioned his men forward, careful, measured, but urgent. Every step across the rubble-strewn streets was a negotiation with risk. One misstep could undo all they had fought to preserve. Sammy Hawkins followed, carrying a bundle of blankets, his youthful grin replaced by a grim focus that spoke of the ordeal's weight. "Almost over," he muttered, voice tight with exhaustion. Turner didn't respond, eyes scanning for hazards, ears straining for the faintest indication of danger. Hiroshi led a group of civilians through the maze of half-collapsed homes, signaling turns with the precision of someone who had navigated these paths in countless seasons of rice planting, storms, and now war. Yuko mirrored his movements, balancing the boy in her arms, alert to every crack in the ground, every fragment of timber that could betray them. Mrs. Keiko Sato, stoic yet fragile, counted villagers as they emerged, her voice steady, a rhythm that anchored hope amidst the lingering chaos. The final stretch to the makeshift landing area stretched before them, open and exposed. Turner gestured for silence, every soldier instinctively lowering their profile, shields of courage raised against the invisible threat that might still lurk. Sammy's foot caught a loose plank. He stumbled but caught himself, muttering, "Not today." Turner allowed the faintest smirk to touch his lips. Humanity persisted, even here. From the corner of the clearing, a flare of movement drew Turner's attention. A girl, no older than 12, limped toward them, clutching a bloodied cloth to her shoulder. Without hesitation, Turner stepped forward, shielding her with his body, motioning Sammy to take the child. Yuko and Hiroshi watched, hearts pounding, as the simple act crystallized the reality they had barely dared to hope for. The soldiers risked their lives for strangers, and nothing about the day's peril had altered that resolve. The wind shifted, carrying the acrid scent of burned rice and wood, yet mingled within it was the faint, almost impossible fragrance of renewal. The village had survived, fragile but intact, and the civilians began to understand that courage could arrive in human form, that the improbable could exist alongside ruin. Mrs. Keiko Sato exhaled, cane tapping the ground with a small, almost imperceptible rhythm, a heartbeat of continuity amidst destruction. Turner signaled the men to assist the remaining civilians, forming lines to carry supplies and the injured toward the relative safety of the riverbank. Sammy passed bottles of water, offering quiet words of reassurance to trembling hands and wide, fearful eyes. Hiroshi and Yuko moved alongside, guiding children and elders alike, the synergy of local knowledge and foreign bravery transforming chaos into survival. Even in the small gestures, a handed blanket, a whispered word, a steadying hand, humanity claimed victory over the violence that had swept through the village. The climax approached as the last injured were lifted into the landing area. Turner's gaze swept the scene, noting every exhausted figure, every trembling child, every soldier who had endured the firestorm. Smoke drifted lazily now, curling into the sky like ribbons of memory, and for a moment, time itself seemed suspended, honoring the fragile equilibrium between peril and perseverance. Yuko held the boy in her arms, the tremor in her shoulders giving way to a tentative, astonished calm. She glanced at Turner, eyes wide with recognition, and for the first time in weeks allowed herself to believe that courage could be both human and contagious. Sammy tripped over a fragment of debris, spilling water over himself, and a ripple of laughter spread through the group, a fragile thread of levity binding them together after hours of terror. Turner shook his head, a faint, wry smile brushing his lips. Even amid devastation, life insisted upon humor, insistence, and persistence. Hiroshi guided Yuko and the other civilians to the far edge of the clearing, toward the safety of temporary shelters, and Mrs. Keiko Sato tapped her cane rhythmically against the ground. Each step was measured, deliberate, a march from fear toward possibility. Turner watched them go, understanding that bravery was not a single act but a continuum, each life saved an echo of courage reverberating across the smoke-stained earth. As the sun fully rose, glinting off helmets, splintered rooftops, and anxious eyes, a single paper crane, improbably untouched by the firestorm, drifted across the clearing. Its fragile wings carried the weight of hope, of resilience, and of lives preserved against staggering odds. Turner allowed himself the smallest nod, a silent acknowledgement that, in the crucible of war, humanity had survived. And even as distant echoes reminded them that danger lingered beyond the horizon, for this village, for this moment, courage had triumphed, and it had been recognized.